40,000 years ago, another species of human walked the earth alongside us, the Neanderthals. They hunted, they made tools, formed families, and survived brutal Ice Age climates. And then, they vanished, leaving us, Homo sapiens, as the last humans standing. So what happened between our species? Did we meet as enemies, or did we actually peacefully coexist? Homo sapiens and Neanderthals side by side. Did the Neanderthals actually disappear? Or do they live on in our DNA? Today we're diving into one of the biggest mysteries in human history, the relationship between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And I'm delighted to be joined by the explorer, paleoanthropologist and presenter, Ella Al-Shamahi. Let's get into it. Ella, it is such a pleasure. It's an honour to have you on the show.
An honour? Jeez. Thank you for having me.
You've been very busy. You've been everywhere at the moment on your paleoanthropology stuff. It's really, really great to have you on. And to talk about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and their interactions with one another, their stories. It is such a fascinating moment in our evolutionary story. Just thinking about those early meetings and how these two types of humans would have interacted with each other.
It is something that I think captures people's imagination. Like, I will say, if even Hollywood are interested in the Neanderthals, we're probably onto something in terms of subject matter here. I think I have to say, obviously I am fascinated by this period. But when you actually study it, how could you not be? Like, these are people who in so many ways were similar to us. And I cannot help but wonder about those interactions. Like the very first Homo sapien and Neanderthal who met each other, what would they have made of each other? Would you have looked at each other and recognized each other as being part of the same genus? Would you have been like, yeah, they're like us? Or would you look at each other and think, who on earth are you? You look funny. You look
species, kind of thing. Yeah.
It's interesting actually. I don't think I've mentioned this to you before, but there is a really old joke amongst paleoanthropologists. You probably heard it, but it's basically this whole discussion about whether Neanderthals are the same as us or not. And this one paleoanthropologist says, look, they're the same as us. If you gave one a shave, you washed it up a bit, put it in a suit and gave it a bowler hat to cover its like weird bulge at the back of the skull, and put it on the New York subway, nobody would notice. And then another paleoanthropologist was like, yeah, maybe that says more about the New York subway than it does about Neanderthals. And I think it captures, I think for me, that recognition issue. Like, would we recognize each other? And actually my very first TV show, when we were just pitching it and playing with it, I was like, guys, we need to bring this scene to life. And it's like one of my proudest moments of television that we managed to put a Neanderthal on the London Underground and ask the audience, would you effectively swap carriages? Would you look at that person and be like, and it really split the audience. Some of them were clearly like, no, they look weird. And others were like, I've seen stranger things.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Or just be polite.
Yeah.
Just just reading
British politeness.
What also is so striking at the moment is Neanderthals have had such a bad rep for so long. And yet you can't help, with all this information coming out and like all this promotion, like your new series and so on, you can't help but love them. You can't feel that actually they're not too different from us.
Yeah, what's really funny is so many of us who are kind of, who study Neanderthals or talk about Neanderthals to the public, we, a lot of us give talks or what have you. And I have to say that it is not uncommon, to the point where I've now had to tell people to stop doing it, for women basically to drag up their poor husbands and be like, could you please feel his skull? Because I'm convinced convinced he's a Neanderthal. And I'm like, oh my. So that kind of association with them being like, bless, like morons is still very much present. But what's really interesting is that, I've been a paleoanthropologist now for a minute, but I've only been in television since, I don't know, 2017 maybe. And when I started, that stereotype of the Neanderthals being knuckle-dragging ape men, basically, I feel like was very, very strong with the public. And the first show that I ever did was called Neanderthals Meet Your Ancestors. And we were really trying to kind of essentially do a PR job on these Neanderthals and kind of portray them in this scientifically accurate light. We dragged in Andy Serkis and...
amazing.
Yeah, we used like motion capture and all this stuff. And what's wild is that now when you talk about to the general public about Neanderthals, it's still an insult. Nobody's calling you a Neanderthal and being like, oh, you're so smart and brilliant and pretty. But so many people now know that the stereotype is incorrect. I don't know if you're feeling that as well.
No, I am. And also on the Ancients podcast, we've done a few episodes on Neanderthals and their stories, and people love like the story of the last Neanderthals as well. But
you had Ludwig on.
We had Chris Stringer on.
Amazing.
And that was, learning about DNA and the lack of genetic diversity, variation we'll get into, I'm sure. But like learning from that, like the interest in it, yes, we still had a comment just like, no, the Neanderthals aren't extinct. I saw one down the pub last week.
Yes.
But yes, there is just a real fascination actually wanting to learn more about who these people are because we now have the information to give like a detailed 40, 50, 60-minute podcast episode about it.
No, completely. I also... Like, it's interesting because I think also just DNA testing, because now people can see some DNA within them and maybe people don't want to think, my ancestors are, whatever. But yeah, it's been really, really interesting to see that kind of people come to terms with who they are. And I think one of the things that I argue a lot, and I'm actually I'm preparing a tour right now, so I'm kind of thinking about the kind of, the messaging that I want to put out to the public. And one of the things that I'm arguing quite heavily is like, look, when we portray these other species like the Neanderthals as incredibly primitive, not only are we doing an injustice to them, like bless them, they're not here to defend themselves, do you know what I mean? But I would argue that we actually make our story less remarkable because those other species were incredible. And if you were to get a lot of paleoanthropologists together in a room, and I mean, we don't agree on much, but if you were to say, all right, like between us and the Neanderthals, who was going to make it? A lot of us would not be betting on ourselves until kind of much further, like much more recently, shall we say? Like even Chris Stringer is like, 100,000 years. He wouldn't have been betting on us. And so for me, I'm like, if we keep portraying them this scientifically inaccurate way, we actually do our own really remarkable story more of a disservice, because how on earth are we the only ones left when the Neanderthals seem to be doing okay? They seem to be more experienced than us numerous times. They were not going locally extinct, and we were in the same geographies sometimes, in fact, often. And you just think, right, that's a change in fortune. So I think it's kind of important to give them their due.
I think absolutely. And as you say, it does make the story of Homo sapiens, us today, being
it's all for our own purpose. It's all for our own narcissism.
Just an ego boost for us and everyone on the planet
They
today.
were amazing, and therefore we must be even more amazing. Something like that.
All right. Well, let's start with like kind of the background of Neanderthals and then Homo sapiens, and then how they interact, which is really interesting. So Neanderthals, how far back in time are we going? Where in the world are we going with the Neanderthals before they meet our ancestors?
Okay, so basically the reason why I'm like sighing is that the Neanderthals keep getting older, bless them. And what I mean by that is we used to kind of think, and when I say we used to, I'm really talking like within the last 10 years. What am I talking about? It was even more recently than that. We used to think Neanderthals kind of 200,000 years old, went extinct 40,000 years ago. Like that's kind of classic Neanderthals. for years before that, like up to 350,000 years, there's kind of this, for a while, we'd see it as this grey zone where you could kind of see Neanderthal features coming in. There was some Spanish Neanderthals, a quite famous collection of Neanderthals who people were always arguing, are they Neanderthal, are they not Neanderthal? The Sima de los Huesos Neanderthals. And you can hear probably from the fact that I'm calling them Neanderthals that the genetic evidence started coming in and it was overwhelmingly clear that they were the Neanderthals. So then very recently the date got pushed back to, okay, well, Neanderthals are 350,000 years. Yeah. I just imagine, like, they're probably taking a lot of offence at how they keep getting older. But then, it's been a real stir recently because Chris Stringer, who, for those of you who are maybe under a rock or are just new to paleoanthropology, Chris Stringer is the Don of paleoanthropology.
We're going to his shrine right after this, right?
Yes,
That's what we have to do.
Yes. His living shrine at the Natural History Museum because he's kind of still there. But yeah, he's an absolutely incredible paleoanthropologist, and he and a number of Chinese colleagues had basically, they have new dates on another species called Denisovans. Now bear with me, right? Because I'm talking about Denisovans, but I'm talking about Neanderthals. So the thing with our family tree is we consider the Neanderthals to be our sister species. And by that, I mean that they are our closest relatives and we share a common ancestor.
Okay. So, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like this shape, basically, like a triangle. But then the Denisovans, we also consider to be the sister species of Neanderthals or very, very closely related. So it's kind of like actually now like there's a three-way thing
like
going
a fork
on.
kind of thing, yeah.
Exactly. And by implication, because we are kind of sister species, the implication is that we will be similar-ish ages, because whenever the split was with our grandparent or our parent species, you kind of broadly expect that those species will be the same age. Now, that's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily have to be true, but broadly speaking. And Chris and some Chinese paleoanthropologists have basically are now of the opinion that they have a Denisovan around 1 million years old.
Oh gosh, okay.
So the implication, and if it had come from many others, I think we wouldn't have been taking it as seriously, but the implication is that therefore if the Denisovans are 1 million years old, the Neanderthals are something similar and we therefore are something similar. So surprise, you're a lot older than you think you are.
I feel this is a topic that we could delve into for a long time, but it's worthy of another episode in its own right. So we'll go from there. But I mean, that length of time is mind-boggling, especially with the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interacting. It's very late in that story.
Yes.
But with Neanderthals, are we largely then just going to be thinking Eurasia?
Yes. Neanderthals that we know of existed in Europe and into Central Asia. We don't have any Neanderthals in Africa. I mean, if you held a gun to my head and were like, are you trying to tell me that no Neanderthal ever made it to North Africa? I'd be like, of course they did. They must have done, right? I've just got no evidence for it, so I probably shouldn't say that. But, there are parts of Spain where you could see Morocco back then, and I find it, plausible. But there's no evidence for them in Africa. There's no genetic evidence. We'll get into interbreeding, I'm sure, in a second, so let me stop there.
Well, if we go forwards to, let's say, 200,000, 300,000 years ago, when it just seemed by that time you've got the idea of the classic Neanderthal. And also, I say Neanderthal, you say Neanderthal. Is there a right or wrong way, or is it both?
My way is right. No.
Okay. I'm the idiot, that's fine.
Okay, so this is taxonomy. So we're a nerdy bunch and we have all these rules about how you they're called the a priori rules in taxonomy, and basically what that means is when you name a species, whoever names the species first, you call dibs. I know that sounds insane, but this is
makes sense. I think it's fair enough.
So if you found a fossil and you just think of the most ridiculous name for it.
Oh, it's like Tristanosaurus or something like that.
Yes,
right?
There we go. Although you can't call it after yourself, so somebody else would have to name it. But so essentially, then you've called dibs on that species. And anyone that comes after, if I come along and I want to give it like a more respectable name, I technically have to go by your name and colleagues have to then take your name as well. Right. Does that make sense? So basically the thing with the Neanderthals is it was a mispronunciation and a kind of spelling, I guess, of a German name, because it's Neanderthal Valley, but the Anglos were basically saying Neanderthal, and so technically it's an incorrect thing, but because it's there, it then becomes complicated. But now if I was to, oh my God, this is complicated, but if I was to write Neanderthal with just a T and not a TH, that would be incorrect. But pronunciation is a bit more ambiguous. So I would argue that we should probably do TH because we made a mistake and we should live with it. And the rules of a priori are such that you have to stick with it. But other people very respectably point out that it's pronunciation, it's not written, and it was a mistake. Maybe grow up and just go with the actual German pronunciation. The truth is, it does not matter, but it's really fun to annoy people.
Which shows how I'm going to show you how malleable I am now. I will now, for the rest of this episode, try and always say Neanderthal.
No, don't. Stick with Tal, because it's honestly, it does not matter. I just have real fun.
There we go. Have fun that way.
Tomatoes.
But so the classic Neanderthal. Let's go through it at the moment. Like physiology, cognitively. I mean, what picture should we have of a Neanderthal?
So think us, but stockier. You're talking the males were, I mean, it's debated, but maybe 5'5" on average. Right, but you've got to remember, Homo sapiens would have been more slender, especially back then, and taller. So there was that kind of difference. Also, in terms of the head itself, it was once described to me, and I really love this description. It's like you got a Homo sapiens skull, and then you just put it on one of those grid systems in a computer, and you kind of, those grid systems where you could like manipulate, and you kind of bring out the front, so it's kind of jutting or prognathic, as we say, and you bring out the back, so you've kind of got what we call an occipital bun at the back. So with a lot of Neanderthals, if you touch the back of their skull, they have quite a big bump. Now, if you touch a lot of people's skulls, women tend to be slightly smoother, men have a bit more ridging, it's a bit rougher, but with Neanderthals, I'm talking about a proper bump at the back. And then they don't really have chins. Chins are actually a very modern invention. There's no real species of human that has chins besides us. They had also very prominent brow ridges. Very, very prominent. And also, you see your forehead and my forehead, they kind of go up, and the Neanderthal forehead is kind of, it's much shorter, but it kind of just kind of recedes straight into the rest of the head, basically. So there are different physical characteristics that broadly, it's been argued, are kind of in line with you're in a slightly colder climate. It kind of makes sense if you're in a colder climate to have a bigger chest comparative to your limbs. Although, honestly, it's constantly debated as to whether... It's really funny, actually. People keep suggesting that is the prevailing theory. But every time people test it, sometimes it proves correct. Sometimes it's like there's something about nasal size, that Neanderthals have slightly bigger noses.
Oh, really?
And there was thinking about that being about, cold air and what have you. The testing is always, it's never conclusive. But I think broadly most of us kind of buy that it's because they were cold adapted.
And then bigger body mass, so then they have to hunt more. But we think of Neanderthals with like spears and the like, and I mean the classic image is them with woolly mammoths or woolly rhinos,
but also even the hunting, like once I don't know that they're necessarily bigger, because if they might be stockier, but they're so short by comparison.
Of course,
that
right.
So not necessarily. But what we do think is that they were doing a lot of short range hunting. Right. So not really projectile weapons. Projectile weapons are quite an incredible invention. Oh my God, especially when you get to arrows, because you can suddenly be incredibly deadly. Obviously, the force, velocity, and what have you, speed is increased, but it's less deadly for you. On the other side, Neanderthals have so many injuries, we think partly because they're doing close range hunting. Think about it. Think about the logic. How interesting is that once you're kind of doing close range hunting, you're risking your life so much more. So we think, very similar hunting to us, though, in terms of the prey that we were eating. I mean, every so often you get a headline that's really interesting, like some archaeologists years ago now started looking at different assemblages, like different within the archaeological record, the animals that were being consumed by us versus the Neanderthals. And they were of the opinion that the Neanderthals were hunting less small animals like rabbits. And so they came to this conclusion that we survived because of small animals. And the logic of that was that we had smaller furs that we could kind of cover ourselves better with. And that's the thing, I think, in the field, everyone's always going, maybe it's this. And you just,
That sounds slightly balmy to me, but
yeah, just go with it.
Yeah. Okay. But also, shall we also mention that, get away with this idea, Neanderthals like always would have been fully naked, they wouldn't have had clothing. I mean, this idea of Neanderthals with ornaments, with art, which is really coming to the fore now. Yeah. This also feels a really big part of their story to explain, even before they meet modern humans.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that Neanderthals did have similar sized brains to us. If you correct for size, maybe a teeny bit smaller, but they did have similar sized brains to us. And we know that they were playing around with, for example, red ochre, like pigments. We know that they had shells that they had pierced holes into that they were putting pigment on, so it looks like they were beaded. They have talons as well from them that seem to have been worn. Also, we've got Brunikel. Brunikel is a massive headache to anyone that sees Neanderthals as primitive. So Brunikel is this one site in France that, we had understandably assumed was Homo sapiens because it's basically full of these, are they stalagmites or stalactites? Stalagmites or stalactites. One or the other.
I know what you mean. Those big things, yes.
Exactly. And they're basically made into these, like, concentric circles. So it's this crazy structure. And everyone had just always assumed this was Homo sapiens. I mean, it looks potentially ritualistic, but it certainly looks creative. Do you know what? And it doesn't seem to have a structural purpose. It doesn't seem to have been because it's an abode and a home and that kind of thing. And then they did the dating on it a while back now, maybe 10 years ago. And they were like, oh, it's really old. It's over 100,000 years old. And in Europe, that's not really Homo sapiens. I mean, it's possible that a Homo sapiens group got to France at that point. It's absolutely possible. It's just we've got no evidence for it. The only evidence at that period is Neanderthals. So if Neanderthals are, what are you doing moving around stalagmites, stalactites and making them into these strange circles in a cave? And that seems incredibly creative to a lot of us. They also, we know now, were doing handprints, if you want to call that cave art. I personally would. Some people wouldn't call it cave art. But I don't know any other species that we know of that was putting their hand in pigment and putting it against a wall. Yeah. You don't get chimpanzees doing that. You don't get Homo heidelbergensis or any of these other species that we know of doing it. Denisovans were probably doing it, but the others, there's no evidence for it.
So that's them. And I remember seeing this when watching one of your episodes on human, talking about the feathered.
Oh, thank you for reminding
as well.
me.
Well, I feel I had to because
yes,
there's
forgot
also
about that.
a great
shocking. Yes, and I think that for a lot of us is incredibly visual. So, for those of you who didn't watch the series Human, I won't take it personally. But there is this moment where we're talking about feathers. And I think what's really interesting is, obviously, as you can imagine, as you know, these things, you kind of talk to your whole team about them, or the production team and the directors and what have you. And we were all kind of just like, feathers will hit it home to people. Because if the Neanderthals were picking out feathers, so we know this, we know it from Italian assemblages, we know it from so many different assemblages in Europe, so many that the Neanderthals seem to be collecting birds, but specific birds. They weren't just after any birds. They seem to favour birds with iridescent feathers, the kind of feathers which are more attractive, look more beautiful, shinier, that kind of thing. And that, that takes your breath away. And as a team, we were like, yeah, we think for an audience, this challenges that assumption of the Neanderthals being knuckle-dragging ape men. Because we today know of so many cultures where they still use feathered headdresses, But not just that, like, teenage girls were best. I, as a teenage girl, and when I say teenage, I mean yesterday, just feathers in like ornaments for your hair. You kind of like it. It's considered to be very beautiful. It's whatever. It's attractive. There's something shiny about it. And to think that, these Neanderthals who, the way we've told their story, they're just interested in survival and procreating. They're doing that. And then they're building these strange structures in Brunnikel in France. I think it forces us to reevaluate the way we see the Neanderthals.
So we painted a really nice picture of Neanderthals.
Yeah.
So if we go towards, like, say, 100,000 years ago, and the Neanderthals are up in Europe, all these amazing artifacts and so on.
And into Central Asia, yeah.
And into Central Asia, thank you. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, we've been on our own path. I mean, our evolutionary story, even up to that point, before we leave Africa, has already it's been quite a journey in itself, hasn't it?
Yeah. Basically, we're an African species. And for those who are kind of like, hold on a second, so how exactly are we thinking we're related? The basic thinking is that there was some kind of ancestral species. We used to call them Heidelbergensis. Now we don't even know if that's a species or not. But anyway, so let's just say species. Let's just say species X, for example, right? Species X started in Africa, we think. Then some of them broke off and went into Asia and Europe, and gave birth to, eventually with time, the Neanderthals. The ones that stayed behind eventually became us. That's the broad thinking. Now, we were in Africa. We started in Africa. We used to think...
hopefully we're not going to go back there a million years again, because I know
up until before COVID, I think it was, we thought it was 200,000 years. Then they found the incredible Jebel al-Hud fossil in, they didn't find it. They just started dating things more accurately in Morocco. And then they were like, oh, hold on a second. We actually think we're 300,000 years old. And now, obviously, if you're to accept Chris Stringer and colleagues' interpretation of things, we're even older than that. Every so often we would leave Africa. And this was the thing, we constantly actually left Africa. But we would leave and we never really got a foothold and we'd become locally extinct. And it was just this pattern that just kept going on. And so actually the first time we think we left and we interacted with the Neanderthals was probably in the Middle East.
Okay.
In fact, it would have been in the Middle East. There's a lot of evidence for us being contemporaneous with the Neanderthals in that region. There's an incredible mountain called Mount Carmel in Israel that has two caves. One cave is called Tabon, which is a Neanderthal cave. And around the same time, so 90 to 120,000 years, there was this overlap with the occupants of another cave called Schul. And Schul had, it was a Homo Sapiens cave. And firstly, let's just acknowledge how amazing that neighbourhood must have been. The same mountain. Mm-hmm. We think the same time, you've got a cave of Neanderthals and a cave of Homo Sapiens. And what I love about this is we actually included this in the series Human in the first episode. It was kind of like an on-the-fly edit. We were kind of like, actually, let's include this. This is such a cool story, like blah, blah, blah. And the Daily Mail, in their review of the episode, and I cannot emphasize this enough, wrote one of the most amusing reviews because they spent most of that review just going, oh my God, what was it like to be on that mountain?
But that gives you a sense. But that does give you a sense of the human mind and the interest in Neanderthals today. It is that, as we said right at the start, it's that first contact idea almost, right?
100%. Like, what was that like? Now, the interesting thing is, the fascinating thing, some might say the bonkers thing is, one of those species became locally extinct and disappeared. And in the way that we've told the story of us and the Neanderthals, you would assume it was the Neanderthals. Turns out it was us, and you see this consistently, and it's to the point that there are some who, when you look at the pattern of Homo sapien movement and what have you, they're of the opinion that the reason why Homo sapiens appeared to have favoured going east instead of going north is because the Neanderthals for the longest time were a formidable force. This is it's a very respectable theory that, you know what, the dates are very interesting because we leave Africa, but we seem to favour the East. At least that's what the current evidence suggests. And we're not in Europe as much. Like we'll dally in, but the number of Homo sapien settlements in Europe seems to be very small. And the argument is, maybe the Neanderthals were a force to be reckoned with.
And this is when the interesting evidence, trying to find more evidence from like the Arabian Peninsula, right?
Yes.
To think Homo sapiens doing that bridge across the Red Sea further south and going that way. And that's another great story, isn't it? To try and learn a bit more about that potential eastward movement of the Homo sapiens.
So the traditional telling is we go via the Sinai of Egypt. And honestly, the way it used to be told is kind of you'd hang around in the north of the Arabian Peninsula, which isn't really the Arabian Peninsula by that point. It's the Levant, because you're looking at like Syria, Israel, Lebanon, those areas, and Iraq. But actually, increasingly, there's evidence to suggest that Arabia was green at various moments. And that whole area was used and was actually at times a refuge. And in fact, there's some people that would argue it's not out of Africa, it's out of Arabia / the Middle East. And of course, our ancestors and the Neanderthals had no sense of, what a continent was. Do you know what I mean? They weren't like, well, that's the African continent and that's Asia. Like, no, this was just land masses to them. So I think there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah, I think so quite as well. It's really interesting, that story. But if we do focus a bit more on Europe and Homo sapiens, I mean, do we know when they do manage to be a bit more successful and get into kind of Europe proper, and then imagining interactions between them and Neanderthal groups there?
Yeah. So I would say starting, there are so many different incursions within once you start looking at Central Asia, there's quite a lot there, but even within Europe itself, you get incursions. I mean, you get incursions technically starting from about 220,000 years ago. You've got some Homo sapiens teeth in Greece.
It's Greece. It's that Greece.
Very
evidence.
confusing.
Yes.
Yeah, let me tell you, when that came out, we were like, can we just not think about that for a second? Like, it's confusing enough as it is. Here's the thing. About 60,000, 50,000, you do start seeing us. I need to check exactly where in the 60,000 mark, but by about 54,000, you start seeing us very present within Europe. But it's interesting because for the years before then, there's a lot of like, we turn up, we disappear. We turn up, we disappear. We're not quite getting the foothold in Europe. And then things kind of start changing. And then by the time you get to 40,000, it's just us.
But we can imagine, let's say between 55 and 60,000 years ago, something like that. Like almost, can we tell from the evidence now that there would have been clear interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens there?
Yeah. There's
peaceful, do we think? Largely peaceful? It's very difficult.
It's so difficult to prove whether it's peaceful or not. There has been Professor Steve Churchill suggested that there might have been some interspecies violence based on some, I think it was maybe some Iraqi material. Was it Iraq? But I think it's very, very difficult to prove something being interspecies. Really, the way you do it is it's like if the injury looks like a projectile injury as opposed to a close range hunting injury, projectile is us. It's not them. But I think what you do tend to find though is culture being transmitted. So there are a few examples that are used. It looks like there's a particular kind of glue that we actually might have picked up off the Neanderthals. We might have learned how to make this particular glue off the Neanderthals. There is a tool that actually is still being used, I have been told, in some very kind of, let's say, haute couture French fashion houses to prepare leather. And that looks like it was picked up from the Neanderthals as well. It might not have been, but that's kind of been a suggestion. But then also people that really, really have incredible sights. There's a few people who have the kind of sights where there's a lot of resolution, so they can really start seeing things in different layers. they will argue certain things. They will argue that it looks like there's some kind of technological exchange or information exchange. There are parameters on it often. I think Maurice Seresi and Ludwig, both of them kind of would have argued similar things, that it does look like there's information exchange, but they're not necessarily, or at least some people are not necessarily arguing that we're sitting there going, right, so how do you do it? Okay, I'll do it. It might have been, some people have argued that it might have been observation. It might have been that people are nosing on each other, basically, spying on neighbouring communities.
And when you say Ludwig, that's Ludwig Slimman? Or,
yes, I'm so glad that you're pronouncing his surname, not me.
No,
who is a fascinating archaeologist with just one of the most fascinating sites.
I hope we'll probably talk about that site in a bit, of this event which happens in a bit, big lot of cold coming in. But what you were saying there, I have to then ask about communication, that potential communication. You've done a lot of work on the handshake.
Yes.
Do you think it's likely that there would have been a Homo sapien Neanderthal handshake?
I know this sounds bonkers, but I have thought about it and looked into it extensively. And I do think the handshake is probably biological. Okay. And I argue this because chimps are bloody shaking hands. Like we know this now. Researchers who observe wild chimp, because it has to be wild, right? Because if they're in a zoo, they might just be copying what some keepers are doing. But wild chimpanzees have been observed shaking hands, and the meaning being broadly similar. So it's basically it was actually some researchers out of St Andrews. They showed that these two male chimps are kind of fighting each other, and after the fight, they come up to each other to shake hands to break up. And the thing is, if chimps are doing something and we're doing something, it's a pretty obvious argument to argue that is by descent. And the thing is, because we do the handshake and we like to see ourselves as being these fancy people, we assume that the handshake is just like a purely cultural thing. But a number of hidden camera experiments have shown that actually handshakes are a really good way of passing on chemo signals. I don't know how familiar the audience is with chemo signals, or the listeners are with chemo signals.
I think you might need to explain that one.
Okay, so chemo signals are basically chemical signals, and we emit chemical signals all the time. We like to think that we're we're beyond that, but as I always argue, we haven't evolved our way out of being animals. So there are, and by the way, if you want to pass some time and just have your mind blown, read up on chemical signals and chemo signals for humans, because there are all these experiments which show that we give off scents when we are happy, when we're sad, when we're scared. And if you think about this with the rest of the animal kingdom, you're like, oh, that makes sense, because they can't communicate as well. So, the person next to me is scared. Maybe there's a wolf nearby or something, right? It turns out we have a similar thing. There are these experiments where they basically get people to put gauze under their armpits. They're not allowed to wash or use deodorant or what have you. And they get them to watch happy films or sad films. And then they take that gauze, they give it to a different group of participants, and they're accurately naming the emotion. It's wild stuff. And so the argument has been that a handshake is a good way of passing along a chemical signal. It's a good way of assessing somebody upon a first meet. And actually using hidden cameras, they were able to show that people are more likely to put their hand to their face and sniff it after a handshake. Yes, and suddenly, as us seeming very prim and proper, we seem more like dogs just smelling each other's backs. But the reason why I'm talking about all this is that I think that the handshake is very old. And if the chimps are doing it as well, the general kind of evolutionary biology principle is that if two very closely related species are doing something, there's a good chance that it's by descent. And so therefore, if we're doing it, then the Neanderthals are also part of that lineage. They would also be doing it. So I think it is possible. I mean, we were having sex with the Neanderthals, so let's just put out there that maybe we'll shake their hands as well.
I mean, you kind of preempted my next question, which is obviously there is some sort of interaction because we know they're shagging with each other as well at the same time. Yes. But it's just fascinating, that communication, to wonder what that communication was. Remember talking to Chris about this, could there have been the equivalent of a Neanderthal Homo sapien translator, as it was, someone who was kind of working to bridge the gap? Those are fascinating questions of how it happened, right?
And I think what I love about this, and again, I think about this a lot is that I think in the way that we talk about history, we often assume that everybody's the same, right? And my personal observation is that people within a group, within a tribe, can be very different. And in my mind, it's always like Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob is always the one, because there's always one person, right? It's usually an aunt, but sometimes it's Uncle Bob, who are just way too friendly. They want to talk to everyone. They want to talk to the strangers. And it's like, in my mind, it's like Uncle Bob is constantly the one going off to talk to the Neanderthals and all the other species and just being like, and his wife's like, oh my God, could you stop it? It's weird. But like, as much as I'm being like slightly, I'm taking the piss there a little bit, but actually, am I? I think realistically, in times when things weren't so bad, I reckon we would have been more comfortable talking to, these strange other humans, the Neanderthals. When times were maybe more difficult, maybe we weren't, but maybe if actually working with them helped us survive, we were. But I also think within a tribe, there would have been variation because we know that's what we're like. Some people would have been much more like suspicious of them and other people would be like, huh.
Which actually always makes interviews sometimes like this so difficult, because you always need to make clear that everyone is not the same, right? And that's one of the beauties of it, of how one Homo sapien viewed a Neanderthal compared to how another one viewed, which I guess might also is evidence through the fact that some Homo sapiens chose to have sex with Neanderthals.
Yeah. And I mean, you say chose also. I mean, okay. So we know what we know now for sure is that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were having sex with each other. We do not know, obviously, what was going on with those interactions. So I often, I'm always like, oh, was it like, they were like, oh, that's the bad boy over there kind of thing, what was it, attraction? For all we know, it might have been part of a trade agreement. It might have been very, very practical. It might have been a bit darker. We just don't know. I think there were so many instances of it, though, that it's also possible that it was many different things. Now, one thing that's has been really, really interesting is trying to work out, was it, like, how was that? And was it like Neanderthal females or Neanderthal males? Like, what was that? And this is where genetics is kind of really interesting, because we have Neanderthal DNA all over our genome. If you are from outside of sub-Saharan Africa, if you're from inside of sub-Saharan Africa, you have some Neanderthal DNA in you, maybe, but not necessarily. Outside of sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 2% on average for an individual. And it spreads all over your genome. So it's important to say that, like, my 2% is going to be different from your 2%, right? But there are a few places where there are these Neanderthal deserts where you don't see much Neanderthal DNA. And the main place you see it is on the sex chromosomes. And that usually indicates that Haldane's rule is at play. Now, Haldane's rule is, we were probably taught this at school, the biological species concept. So the biological species concept is that two things are two different species, two animals are two different species if when they have sex, the offspring is infertile, right? That's like, oh, you're two different species. Now, one of the things about that is that the sex chromosomes will basically have less DNA from the other because of Haldane's rule. It's kind of the way it goes. So there is that. So initially we were like, okay, well, Haldane's rule is at play. It's that we're becoming two different species, or we are two different species. And that's why there is this desert there of Neanderthal DNA. Only, just in the last few weeks, there's been some research coming in, and the suggestion is that actually there's another possible explanation for why there's no Neanderthal DNA on the Homo sapiens sex chromosomes. And it's that it was Homo sapiens females running off with Neanderthal males. And that really makes me laugh, because I'm like, even back then there was a precedent for liking a Neanderthal.
The Neanderthal bad boy, there you go.
Yes. Have an image of, like, because it would have been our grandmother. If this is correct, it would have been our grandmother, right? And I just have an image of her looking at the great-grandmother being like, but Mama, I love him. And it just being her and Uncle Bob at the wedding. You know what I mean?
But it's then also very interesting to think that, like, if it is if it's a Homo sapien woman giving birth to a Neanderthal boy, and then
they've got big heads.
Well, that's another question
Yeah.
entirely, isn't it? It's like the actual the physical,
Yeah.
the actual process of giving birth and the like, but also like community-wise, what that would have been if your dad was a Neanderthal, if your mum was a Homo sapien. It's another of those fascinating questions that, you know, people can think about for ages and just think about it.
Yes, and it's so interesting because I think one of the things that I was really keen on with the series Human and just generally with my stuff generally when it comes to communicating science is that I think in often the way we do paleoanthropology, it's quite emotionless, shall we say? And I can't help but do emotion. Some people might say it's because I'm Arab. I don't know. But I come to it with emotion. And it was really interesting because we had quite a lot of discussions with the BBC about this because I think, you know, they want to make sure that they're doing justice to the science, and I came in very loudly and very strongly being like, we need to put the human back in human evolution. I was like, we are doing a disservice to these species and our ancestors by portraying them as if they're devoid of emotion, because actually emotion is so central to being human. I would argue the magnitude, the gamut of emotion that we have is remarkable, right? And the ability to articulate it. And so I'm like, what are we doing? And, you know, it got to the point where I was so firm and I was just like, look, you know, you allow David Attenborough to give more emotion to ungulates than you allow me to give to our ancestors. And it was really interesting because everyone went, oh, okay. And my argument, like one of the arguments because they were like, but we're in speculative territory. And I'm like, that's okay. We make it clear we don't know for sure. But I'm like, just based on anthropology and ethnography, how could we not ask if a hybrid child would feel belonging or not? Yeah. We know from ethnography, from anthropology, that people that are mixed, outsiders, it is complicated. Now, we know some tribes much more welcoming towards individuals than others. Sometimes as well, it's dependent upon the individual, right? But we know that these are discussions. We know this consistently. This is like so well documented. And so for us to feel nervous about having that conversation is wild. And I was like, being that I'm a third culture kid, especially, I think it is, and being that I'm a woman, it would be even more insane for me not to say, as a third culture kid, as somebody whose parents Arab, who I was also partially raised by my nan who's white, like how would that have been? Would that have been complicated? Would the mother have been terrified for that child? Would she have been like, oh, I hope they look like my species and not the other species because I don't know how? I was like, it is absolutely within our right to ask these questions. We shouldn't be giving answers unless we know for sure, but we can be speculating within the realms of what we know of anthropology and ethnography. And it was really interesting, and everyone accepted it, and we went for it. And it's really interesting to see the feedback from people, because people are like, oh, they're us, aren't they?
Because it's no longer people think, oh no, they were too simple brained to have any thoughts like that. It's like, no, that thinking's out the window now. Yeah.
I mean, if you've got Homo naledi burying their dead, I'm sorry, we can be talking about whether hybrid Neanderthal and Homo sapien kids felt that they belonged or not in a tribe. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that discussion.
This is so interesting. It's amazing to delve more into actually the human nature of this. But if we go more like Homo sapiens against Neanderthals, and we mentioned earlier how Neanderthals, like for much of the time, it seems like they're better. Yeah. They're better at surviving and so on, and we have the local extinctions. So there seems a great example of this some 55,000 years ago. The climate in Europe gets colder, and this is not the time when Neanderthals go extinct. This is still the time when it seems they're better prepared than we are.
I mean, there is a little bit of a discussion about the exact dates, but yes, there is very clear evidence of Homo sapiens in Europe. And then it seemed, and we were kind of in some of the same geographies, and then we just disappear from Europe. But the Neanderthals don't. Now, we do know that the climate was getting quite difficult, But, the Neanderthals weren't exactly having a heyday either, but they just seem to be able to cope with that harsher climate better than us. And we do generally see a pattern of that with the Neanderthals. Don't get me wrong, the Neanderthals, also when the climate got bad, you would notice them, more in the south, for example. But they were still able to cope with those climates a bit better than us. And then sometime after 55,000 years, the tide starts very, very, very slowly changing. And it's really difficult to square it all up because, there was some research coming out of Germany, for example, that was showing that the Neanderthal sites in Germany were having a heyday from 40-something thousand years to, for 10, 20, I think it was probably until about 70,000 years. And there were so many sites in Germany, et cetera, and suddenly there was this complete crash.
Wow.
So it's also really difficult. It turns out it's very difficult to stalk ancient people because it's really hard to get demographic data and to be really sure. But what we do see is this pattern. We see this pattern of us being in Europe, hanging on for a few thousand years, and then just disappearing. And you get it actually in Ludwig's site, actually. You get this one layer where the technology just changes, and it's Homo sapien technology. It's and it's interesting because Ludwig was looking at this technology going, this isn't the technology in all the other layers. The layers above and beyond and below. The layers above and below this layer are the same kind of technology. And then suddenly you get this alien technology in the middle. And then they found a tooth. And when they did the DNA analysis on the tooth, it was a Homo sapiens tooth. So they realized they had an incursion of Homo sapiens in this one site in France. And there are some other places as well. And then they just disappeared and the Neanderthals came back to the site. Isn't that remarkable? And then basically you see this decline, and it's just fascinating. It's only a very few thousand years that you get it. Where we just kind of, and you can probably tell that I'm avoiding dates here because I'm so stuck on dates. I feel so frustrated by it because I think it really helps you guys, the listeners and the audience kind of visualize stuff. But the frustrating thing is the dates keep changing, and also we keep hearing rumors that the dates are about to change again. So, not particularly in this case, but we just know it's a thing. But I will say, when I talk about overlaps, I'm not talking 30,000 years. I'm talking much, much, much less than that. And then basically the Neanderthals just slowly just disappear. There's this, or if you want to look at the German case, there seems like a crash, but generally speaking, they just disappear.
Which begs the question, why? Why do we think that it's in those following few thousand years that Neanderthals, I know there's evidence of cannibalism around that time, but might not be, it's does it seem to be a combination of factors all coming together that...
If this was a game show, they'd be like, yay, he won! Well done.
Sorry, I was thinking of the Oprah, you get a point or you get a point or something like that, but I couldn't quite do it in my mind for the Neanderthal.
No, in my head it was the game show where it's the noise of, when you've struck gold. Okay. And it's right answer. Anyway, sorry, that was my sound effect. Okay, so if you were to put 100 paleoanthropologists in a room and ask them why the Neanderthals went extinct, it would be hilarious because the Venn diagrams would be everywhere. But anyway, and there's always one person that's not even within the Venn diagram. They're just a circle off somewhere in Siberia.
You're saying, but did they actually go extinct?
Yes. Yes, you say that. Yes, some people will argue that actually they never went extinct and that they just, it's a bit like when London just kept getting bigger and bigger and just usurping all the towns around.
Fair enough.
No, some people actually, and you know what, there's an argument for that, right? I think it is fair to say we cannot agree, and I think there is a reason for that. I think it's because the evidence is, there's a lot of different reasons, I think we can say. I personally find it very, very hard to ignore a few pieces of evidence. I think the Neanderthals were clearly doing fine for a very, very long time. Or they were surviving much better than us in those climates for a very, very long time. It makes sense because they were adapted to them for hundreds of thousands of years. Whereas remember, we were the immigrants, we were the new ones, we weren't adapted. Neanderthals, you are right, had very, very small effective population sizes. What I mean by that is they were really inbred. For those who are kind of interested in genetics, they had very, very, very low levels of heterozygosity, which means their DNA just wasn't very diverse. It reflects a really small gene pool. And as a result of that, you interpret that as being, okay, so they are small in number, which basically means that they are more likely to be riddled with diseases, which we do know. For example, there are some Neanderthals from a cave called Al Sidran, where they had the kind of diseases you associate with very, very severe inbreeding. But beyond that, what does a small population size lead to? I would argue a small population size means that cumulative culture, which I'm obsessed with, is not as strong of a player. Now, cumulative culture is this idea. It's a mainstream theory, but I will say not necessarily everybody accepts it. It's the idea that every generation builds upon the previous generation's art, technology, science, like Miley Cyrus, like just everything, right? Every generation just gets better than the previous generation in terms of the ability to accumulate knowledge. And the thing with cumulative culture, yes, it requires a brain that likes to copy and is plastic, likes to copy each other, but the really big thing that cumulative culture needs is numbers. And people, I think, sometimes get lost with cumulative culture because it's just harder to visualize. But the best way that I can explain cumulative culture to people is that if, let's say, you and I were part of a tribe that was only like, I don't know, 20 people, suddenly you and I would have to get really, really good at hunting, gathering, and just about everything in between to survive. If our tribe consisted of 500 people or 5,000 people, we are suddenly taking a massive sigh of relief because we're like, oh, we can take a breather. But also it means that you can go off and specialize and I can go off and specialize. But the other side of it is that, like, I don't know, for example, if one of us invents like the most basic cake in the world, like a sponge cake, right? And sorry, I'm obsessed with sugar, as you've probably guessed from a little earlier when I had a lot of sugar. Anyway.
When Ella came in, yeah, you needed a sugar rush straight away and we were happy to provide. So it's quite right.
Yeah, something like that. So basically, if one of us invents the Victoria, like just a normal sponge cake, and our tribe is only 20 people, it's going to realistically stay as a sponge cake for generations. But if you have hundreds of thousands of people in that group, even tens of thousands, that sponge cake is going to turn into a red velvet quicker, right? Because there's just more people looking at each other, copying each other. There's more brain power on it. Homo sapiens, we know, had a much, 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 much bigger population than all the other species that were on the planet, and certainly than the Neanderthals. That gives you a massive advantage. Let's say our brains aren't actually superior. I think they probably were slightly more plastic, but let's say they weren't. Just numbers alone could explain the better technology, because there's just more of you on it.
And better technology, we mean like the hand axe type, the bow and arrow technology.
Bow and arrow, stuff, yeah. Even weaving. I mean, Chris Stringer argues that weaving is potentially a thing. Cool. And weaving, I know it might not sound as sexy. For folks, for those of you who are listening to this and watching this right now, I'm sorry, weaving is not as sexy as a bow and arrow. Let me explain. The thing, once you invent weaving, your kids are going to stay warmer. Because you can invent, like, you know, the side bits as opposed to flappy bits. Your nets also become better. Your ability to transport food. Yeah, we need to make weaving sexier. That's what I'm getting at. But also, I will say there's one other thing. The advantage of Homo sapiens, in my opinion, is that we had Africa as the mothership. And Africa as the mothership, Africa is kind of an incredible continent, and one of the things about it is that if we had an offshoot of pioneers, for example, in Europe, if the climate got bad and they went locally extinct, and so did the Neanderthals there, we can replenish from Africa. The Neanderthals couldn't. That's a long-winded explanation for why I think they went extinct. And watch, as soon as another person sits in this chair, there will be another theory.
And they're in one. No, I don't think so at all. I think that was great. And I think, yes, to finish on that Africa point and the fact that, yes, we had failed incursions before, always came back, like the Romans in battle and the like. But like, it always come back and adapt, and that larger gene diversity and all that stuff, you know, it does. You explained it very well, and I kind of explain how Homo sapiens emerged, the top dogs at the end, which I'm sure would explain a bit more in our next chat together. But Ella, this has been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thanks for having me.
A great episode. Yeah. It just goes me to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
I so appreciate it. Thank you for having me.